Hello and welcome to today's event, Rebuilding Labor and Worker Power to Respond to AI. My name is Mary Alice McCarthy, and I lead New America's Center on Education and Labor. For those of you not familiar with New America, we are an independent and nonpartisan think and do tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., and focused on a broad range of issues affecting American democracy and society. Our mission is to identify policies and practical strategies that help us live up to our highest ideals as a country, our ideals of equality, fairness, opportunity, and shared prosperity. And when we were founded in the late 1990s, technological changes, their promises and their challenges were at the heart of our concerns, driving much of our research and policy development. That continues to be the case 25 years later. So today we are here to talk about the impact of new technologies and what those developments mean for the world of work. Specifically, we're going to be focused on the field of artificial intelligence, where there have been some significant breakthroughs and advances just over the past few years. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers who will address the impact of AI on workers and workplaces, both in the future, but also in the present. This event is part of a broader body of work we are undertaking at New America with our Future of Work in the Innovation Economy initiative, which we launched last year, and which is focused on aligning technology research, development, and implementation with the goals of economic inclusion and shared prosperity. So before we dive into what's going to be just really a fantastic discussion, I just want to take a moment to note how this event embodies an important shift in the conversation around the future of work. You'll remember that these conversations started in earnest after the Great Recession, and they focused almost exclusively, with exceptions, but they focused they focused heavily on the effects of automation and job loss in particular. There are lots of predictions of massive job losses, some of which turned out to be true in some sectors, and some of which still have not turned out to be true. But overall, whether the predictions were right or not, the overall tone of the conversation was very pessimistic and also pretty deterministic. There was a certain fatalism to the future of work conversations, an acceptance of the idea that job loss and dislocation were an inevitable outcome of technological change, and that the best we could do was to cushion the blow for workers. Workers themselves were rarely cast as protagonists in these conversations, but rather as passive victims of technological change. That perspective, in turn, sort of limited the range of policy solutions that I think were being actively discussed at that time, and focused them almost exclusively on how to help workers after they had lost their jobs through strategies like reskilling or policies like portable benefits or a universal basic income. Now, of course, skills training and portable benefits are both important and very effective policy tools, and very much worth fighting for. We advocate for them every day. But today's conversation will be a little bit different, and we'll focus on a broader set of strategies. We will focus on strategies for shaping the development and deployment of technology in ways that enhance job quality, that increase both worker and firm productivity. It's not going to take job loss as a given. It will include worker-led strategies for harnessing the benefits of technology broadly. And it's not going to be a theoretical discussion either. You will hear from an amazing set of leaders who have made the shift away from the sort of determinism toward worker agency when it comes to technological change, and you'll hear examples of how they've done it and are doing it. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our esteemed panelists so that we can get the conversation going. At this point, I was supposed to be introducing Kay Firth Butterfield, who is the CEO of Good Tech Advisory and the former inaugural head of AI at the World Economic Forum. Kay was going to share with us some of her pioneering work of engaging with the business community around how they in turn could engage with worker organizations in the process of designing and deploying technology. Unfortunately, Kay is caught in some sort of airport flight delay, labyrinth. We've all been there. We wish her well, and we hope that whenever she does touch down or get to where she's going, we're looking forward to catching back up with her. So we're going to kick off instead with Lisa Takeuchi-Cullen, who we're incredibly honored to have with us here. Lisa is the president of the Writers Guild of America East. Just as many of us were first becoming more familiar, we're finally becoming sort of familiar with AI and its practical applications with the release of ChatGPT-4. The Writers Guild, we learned, was way ahead of all of us, thank goodness, and showed everyone what it meant to embrace a new technology while also protecting workers and incorporating it into a negotiating process. After Lisa, we'll hear from Amanda Ballantyne, the director of both the Technology Institute and the Working for America Institute at the AFL-CIO, the country's largest labor federation. Over the past decade, the AFL-CIO is becoming a leading voice and a very active participant in conversations around technology development and implementation and their effects on workers. And then we'll hear from Andrea Dellendorf, strategic advisor on labor, tech, and economic justice, and the former executive director of United for Respect. Andrea has been deeply engaged in conversations around the impact of AI on workers, specifically in the healthcare, hospitality, and retail sectors, and how to bring those issues into a collective bargaining process. And then we're going to move to government and hear from Commissioner Keith Sonderling of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. As you know, the EEOC is responsible for upholding the rights of workers from discrimination, from harassment, from other civil rights violations, for which AI presents some new and special challenges. Guiding us through this discussion will be my New America colleague, Shailin Jyotishi, a senior advisor at the Center on Education and Labor, and the founder and managing director of the Future of Work and Innovation Economy Initiative. So we're excited about the conversation. Thank you for joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Shailin.
Thanks very much, Mary Alice. And I echo my thanks to our panelists as well as our audience for tuning in. As a reminder, please do share your questions using the Slido platform you have on screen. We will be having a Q&A period towards the end of today's session. Well, with further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. We have a really great program and lots to cover. So I'm going to start first with you, Lisa. You know, as Mary Alice mentioned, the Writers Guild really made history last summer with the Hollywood writers' strike, which culminated in this deal around how AI can support, not replace, worker contributions. It was the first deal of its kind, as labor scholar Adam Seth Litwick explained in a New York Times article. The deal you all struck rewrote the rules around AI. And it set a precedent for other unions to follow course. And of course, since that time, many have. But as we've discussed, the work is not finished. There's more to be done. And so my first question to kick off our discussion, keeping in mind this, historic role that the Writers Guild has held in the AI and labor nexus, what's next? What are you hearing from your members in terms of concerns and hopes that other labor and worker voice entities might learn from as they move forward in their work? Lisa.
So the Writers Guild of America, East and West, represent about 12,500 TV writers and screenwriters for whom we bargain a collective contract every 3 years. So when we started having meetings about our upcoming contract, this past contract, AI was barely on our radar. And it was something that a small faction of members who were super, geeky and interested in that field were bringing up as a thing. But I mean, think about even a year, 2 years ago, right? AI was barely in the conversation, and then suddenly it was everywhere. So by the time our negotiations started, AI was in our pattern of demands from the jump. Our employers, who are the Hollywood studios, represented by a collective group, a trade group called the AMPTP, refused to even discuss or counter our AI proposals. So to be clear, and referring to something that you spoke to, Shailin, we never demanded to disappear AI, right? We never demanded to ban it. What we wanted were guardrails. And what we were asking for were 3 main points. And one was that AI cannot be considered the source of the idea. And the second was that AI cannot be the author of a script, right? The writer has to be a human. And the third was that we wanted guardrails around how our material was used to train AI. It took us 148 days of striking to even get it on the page. It was the very last item that our employers tackled. And that's how important it was to them, which should tell you how important it should be to us. But we finally we won those concessions. We won the first and the second, but not the third. So we did not get any sort of guaranteed protection of acknowledgement or compensation when our members' material is used to teach AI. And remember that most of our work is public, right? It's aired on television and on movies. It's out there. So we know that these technologies are consuming our work without our knowledge or our compensation to learn and to train. So going forward, what we achieved was that now AI is a mandatory subject of bargaining, right? Because now that it's in our contract, it has to be bargained. And going forward, our guild, the Writers Guild East, which is based east of the Mississippi, we include journalists as well in broadcast news and in online media. So we have included AI in all of our journalism contracts as well. But I think that the strongest point that we can make here today is that the most powerful mechanism we have to fight AI taking over jobs is collective power.
Thanks very much for that, Lisa. And the call out of the implication of AI in education is especially important for, the work that we do at New America, covering the education to work continuum from K through 12, moving into the workforce. Now, Amanda, onto you. Let's span out to the labor movement as a whole. Amanda, you're representing AFL-CIO, the largest federation of labor unions in the country. And in December, AFL-CIO signed a major deal with Microsoft around AI to create this open dialogue around how AI must anticipate and include worker voice in the development and implementation stages. And in March, I thought it was really striking. Politico ran the headline, Liz Schuler, the head of AFL-CIO, wants AI to reinvigorate the labor movement. I think really emblematic of the moment that we're in right now. It's been about 6 months since the Microsoft deal. How are you and your affiliates thinking about negotiating around AI?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me in this panel. It's it's an honor to be here and with you, Shaylin, and these guests, particularly you, President Takeuchi Koen. I would say that the leadership of the Writers Guild is really important in terms of understanding the moment and the trajectory of the labor movement's approach. I think that, we start by saying a few things. The labor movement has always negotiated and bargained over new technologies. That's one of the major ways that we help protect working people and help them navigate big shifts and changes in the economy. And in some ways, AI is similar. We have the tools in large measure to really make this technology work for working people. We have collective bargaining, which President Takeuchi Koen rightly stated is the first and best way for workers to regulate AI and to make it work for them in their workplace and in their industry, and to ensure that they're sharing in the prosperity gains and also able to put guardrails on the technology. We also have a really strong voice in public policy and in elections, right? And we know that this technology, I should say these technologies, will have a really dramatic impact on many, many aspects of our lives, our work lives, our home lives, our financial lives, our understandings of norms in our society like privacy and democracy. And the labor movement is, in general, we treat people like whole people. So we're looking across all of those vectors and looking to protect working people and their families, starting with collective bargaining and then fanning out. We know with these technologies, there are clear and obvious dangers for workers, worker health and safety, industry intensification, speed up, de-skilling, job loss. And actually, I think what we would say is a hollowing out of really important professions that not only guide like our economy, but also our cultural understanding and our understanding of democracy. Those are things that workers have deep knowledge about how to solve, and so looking to worker knowledge and really understanding that working people not only understand how to do their jobs well, they're also experts in the technology they use at work every day. They know what's good about it. They know what's bad about it, what might not be safe about it. They're the troubleshooters. They're the people at the end of the day who are having to make the workplace operate. And unions really are partners in making industries work because they're aggregating worker knowledge and bargaining. They're bargaining to protect workers, but also to make the workplace more efficient, right? When you look across our unions, there are some cross-cutting themes with these technologies: bias, speed up, de-skilling, The sort of disaggregation of work that leads to layoffs. These technologies often are learning from the work that people are doing, like President Takeuchi Cullen said, and then using that knowledge to sort of automate people's work. And so bargaining over those and then also passing public policy measures is really important. But also helping partner to implement technologies in a way that is good for the work. And we have a lot of examples of that. So one of the things I'll start by saying is with the Microsoft deal, CWA did a lot of work with Microsoft. The Communications Workers of America did a lot of work with Microsoft, and they negotiated the first neutrality agreement with Microsoft, and that was in the gaming division, Activision. And I'll let them speak to that in a future event. I hope you'll host one if you haven't already. But what happened is that the process that Microsoft went through in order to get to that deal, which Microsoft wanted for a variety of reasons, it's created this labor management partnership, but also created a deep level of education among leadership at Microsoft about unions and the role of unions. And so when we at the AFL-CIO started a conversation, and I should say President Schuler really, really personally led these conversations, when she started the conversation with Microsoft, there was already a curious partner. And we ended up with a very interesting agreement that included a neutrality agreement that covers Microsoft's domestic footprint and has requirements around the way Microsoft works with its suppliers around unionization efforts. There's also within that deal agreements to partner on product development and design standards that include worker voice. So that's an experiment that we're doing with Microsoft. Can we work with this big company to talk about what it would mean to actually meaningfully engage workers and unions in the development of these technologies that are then moved out? Can that be a more public conversation about the tech industry in general? And then we also are having conversations both about workforce policy and upskilling that centers workers. And so the question for us is, can you move the technology in a way that, like the Writers Guild did, puts the technology and the power of it in the workers' hands, and makes it more about a sort of shared commitment to both more efficiency in the workplace that is worker-centered, and then also more prosperity that's shared more equitably across our society. So I'll stop there, but happy to take questions.
Very insightful, Amanda. And the note about the role of workers and the expertise of workers and sort of balancing those lived experiences on the ground with the professional expertise that management has, I know is something that we've also been observing at the federal level. Last month, we hosted an event with the director of the National Science Foundation, Sethuruthman Panchanathan, around the implications of the NSF regional innovation engines on education, workforce, and labor, in which it became really clear that through this NSF engines investment and others such as the EDA tech hubs, we really have an opportunity to bring worker voice more upstream to the point of technology development in light of this new era of industrial policy awareness. It's certainly very exciting. And since Kay isn't with us, I'd be remiss if I didn't flag that, it was really exciting for Kay and I to sort of have this discussion at the World Economic Forum around how AI could be harnessed to improve job quality, in which I remember an interview with Tim Noonan of the International Trade Union Confederation, in which he said, unions are mischaracterized as technology Luddites. Unions stand ready to work with employers and technology developers to maximize the benefits and mitigate the risks of these new techs. So, lots of, I think, insightful lessons to be learned from around the world and what could be the art of the possible. So very, very insightful. Andrea, let's move on to you. You're a labor organizer for over 30 years. You've been in the trenches in this work. You've worked on the ground with locals in healthcare and service and hospitality industries. You've done a lot of work in advocating for worker rights, respect to surveillance and algorithmic management, including working with national organizations around this issue set, including Partnership on AI and others. As a strategist around labor tech and economic justice, and based on your experiences, what is your advice or call to actions for workers and organizers and worker-centered policy organizations too when navigating AI? What should be at the top of their minds?
Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation so far and excited to join in. So, as you mentioned, I have a background working with people in a range of low-wage service sector jobs and have seen very directly both the extent to which technology's introduction into workplaces can be extremely harmful and extractive when people do not have a voice in engaging and do not have access to collective bargaining and vehicles to advocate for themselves. I started my career working with Unite Here, which I'm going to come back to because I think they're a real model of the kind of proactive engagement around technology that is really part of the path here. But I also spent time working with subcontracted janitors and security officers and groundskeepers in the Silicon Valley and saw the real disconnect that exists often between the technology sector and the lower wage jobs that on which they depend and the effectiveness of strategies where workers organize collectively, even when they don't have a union, to establish a real dialogue and relationship and what that can mean. And then, as you mentioned, I spent many years working with people at Walmart and Amazon, where we saw both algorithmic scheduling getting introduced that was, that could very easily have had an input around people's childcare needs or second jobs needs, but instead were designed and deployed only around peak profitization and customer when customers were going to come in to manage staffing for that, but completely disregarded the human needs of people doing the work when it very easily could have. And I actually, just as a side note, I ran into somebody at a partnership in AI event who was part of the IBM team that developed some of this algorithmic management and asked him that question. And he was like, oh, fascinating. No one's ever sort of mentioned that as a possible input, that people should have their personal needs around scheduling considered. And I think what Amanda's raising about the importance of worker voice upstream and the design of workplace tech, I think is really important. And I also saw the ways that Walmart used surveillance technology to come in and surveil union activists and fire people for participating. And so I think we really need to look and think about all the ways that technology is coming in. So to start, to answer your question more specifically, there's a few elements of context that ground my offerings on strategy. One is that we need to be clear on what we're talking about with AI. I think a lot of times we sort of start and end the conversation on this new phase of generative AI and what might be coming with artificial general intelligence. But I think it's critical that we understand that this is all this is going to be layered on the last rounds of technology. And this is going to be integrated with surveillance tech, with algorithmic management, with algorithmic scheduling. And it is really going to be impossible to parse out what is generative AI, what is the last generation of algorithmic management. And I really always encourage a very wide lens on this, that we are looking at all of these different technologies. The second is that we really need to be thinking and looking at the concentrated power of the industry as well and across the whole stack. Because, and sort of what is the value chain that's happening here? What is the driving force and profit maximization strategy? Because many of these technologies are being deployed to, and even though I agree with the broad point that we cannot just approach this all as, taking this on as a labor replacement problem, but it is a power problem that we do not have enough labor power and social power right now. And therefore, the way that technology is being deployed is to just extract a little bit more productivity, to surveil, to squeeze, to replace. And unless we can build and flex the kind of power to redirect it, it is going to continue to operate in that context. Because even if you're a little startup building something new, you're ultimately paying rents back to the owners of the tech and the owners of the tech that own the tech. And it's all playing out across this concentrated value chain. And the second is that we need to really always be understanding just how much human labor is actually powering these technologies. I think it is largely invisible to people in the United States that these, large language models did not just come out of somebody's brilliance, Sam Altman's garage or whatever. Like, this is digital sweatshops in the Philippines and Kenya, in India, that are building these, and we are not as a society paying people the true cost of what it takes to really build those. And so even as we are looking right now at some real questions being called on the builders of AI around the sustainability of the financial model, it is also resting on the undercompensated labor of, who even knows how many people, because it's very underreported. And that is not even to get at the question of the energy, water, natural resource demands of this technology as well, that have really significant social cost. The last couple things are, one, that this is all operating within an ideological framework of techno-utopianism, that we just need to put all of our faith in these technology leaders to solve all of our problems, and that a lot of particularly this latest round of generative AI is layering into industries that have some of the lowest union density that is out there, which means that, even while Amanda, I think, is right that collective bargaining is the most effective way, period, we have a disconnect that we do not actually have wide-scale collective bargaining in the industries that are most at risk here, which means we are not structurally prepared to contend for power and raise standards and ensure that workers, get their share of the productivity gains and involved with the tech. And, it kind of a top line, I think we have to broaden our sense of imagination of what is possible, because if we are only living, in the marginal ability to impact and shape this, but I think we need to widen the lens and have very big ambition on behalf of all of society around technology. And there's two frameworks that I use around this. One is, in my thinking on this. One is Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson's incredible book, Power and Progress, which, even just to read a review of it, I think is so helpful, because it lays out and makes the case that this really isn't a question of technology, and it's not that new. This is just a new iteration of 1,000 years of technological advances, and the ways in which we meet the challenge of technology is less about the tech, but it's about what is the social and economic structures of the world that we want, what are our values, what kind of society do we want to live in, and how do we start to insist that technology serves that vision versus serves the profit motives of a small set of corporate actors. And they talk in the book about, we need the policy and regulatory framework. We need to change the narrative where people, not just technologists, hold the answer for the future of technology and how it's applied. And then 3, that we have to more effectively wield countervailing force to contend for how this is playing out. And I would just say that the WGA strike did more to change the conversation about technology and AI than any think piece, any book that anybody wrote. It was the thing that shifted. And I think that the frame of countervailing power is a really helpful way to think about it. And in terms then of strategy, I look at really 3 things that, on the one hand, we need to be looking at the harms and dealing with the harms, of course, right? But if we start and end there, we're missing the big picture. We need to be talking about how workers co-evolve with the technology, make a claim on the productivity gains, evolve with it, have a voice, is the second principle. And then the third is that this is really a power question. And how do we build the kind of power that we need? And how do we really see working people in the working class as being an essential source of power to redirect technology in service of everybody, not just themselves? And so really concretely, 3 things. So minimum standards, right? We need to do that in collective bargaining. We need to do that on state policy, federal policy, and legislation. What are the new things that we need? And then how are we taking advantage of every single regulatory enforcement hook at the state and federal level? And I think at the multinational and global infrastructures as well, to advance an agenda for workers that create some bright lines around surveillance tech, algorithmic tech, coevolution with technology, sort of what is a set of basic standards. And I know there's a lot of different unions that have come up with principles. I think that the CWA principles for bargaining is, and policy is exceptional. I really encourage people to take a look at the Partnership on AI's Shared Prosperity Guidelines, which provide an analytic framework to analyze how technology is being both developed and deployed and what its impact on workers is going to be, and actually talks about shared prosperity gains. The second big category is I think we need bigger and bolder moves here in terms of what we are calling and demanding. We need more fights like the WGA, right? Like, what is the fight? What is the banner fight around AI and healthcare, right? I'm sure you've all seen, the ads for NVIDIA replacement nurses at $9 an hour using AI nurses. Like, healthcare is a major site of struggle. And like, what is the banner fight? Like the Writers Guild strike that's happening in healthcare. We've got, Athena that is taking on Amazon. We've got, gig worker organizing. Like, we need more exertion of countervailing power to change the narrative. And then we need to be, and that includes people who, both bargaining, but also people who don't have a union making big claims. And I think we have to have a serious conversation about sectoral bargaining on these issues. And we need sectoral bargaining for everybody always anyway, but I think there's a particular moment because of the urgency of how all this AI is coming into workplaces to just do a leapfrog around demanding sectoral bargaining. And then the last point is that I think it's critical that we, as an underlying philosophy on this, have a common good agenda that labor is advancing, that this is workers advocating for their own impacts in their own workplaces and in their own industries, but it's also, what would it look like if working people were fighting on behalf of society about how technology is being deployed and developed. And if we look at, the example of the teachers who go on strike for class sizes or to get, tech, sort of extractive surveillance tech out of schools, how could we imagine that playing out with public sector workers who are actually have an agenda around how technology is going to be used for public benefit eligibility, as well as how it's going to shape their own conditions? What would that look like for teachers to make some bold, big demands around technology and AI in education and then in healthcare? And I think we see this playing out in the technology sector itself, where a lot of the self-organizing, around that's happening out of the tech sector, the animating issue is not just people's economic needs at work, but it is about how are the firms that they work for deploying and developing their technology and taking on the sale of surveillance tech to military regimes or to ICE enforcement. And I think this excites and animates and is an organizing issue for people that we need to have some more vehicles for. And then the third is, how do we also make sure that the organizing that's happening in the US sees itself as in relationship with organizing that's happening around the world, where a lot of the impacts on work are most severe and most at risk. And if we're only looking at kind of a nationalist agenda for workers in the US, we are, I think, missing history in terms of how all of these dynamics are playing out globally.
Thanks very much, Andrea. There was a lot in there. I'll just give one flag for audience. We will actually be hosting a book talk with Simon Johnson later this year, so look out for that in future correspondence. Commissioner Sonderling, on to you and the federal government role in this. In addition to the Department of Labor, the EEOC has a really important role in enforcing labor laws and worker protections that are on the books. Under your leadership and that of your colleagues, the EEOC has put out quite a bit around AI, including launching the Artificial Intelligence and Algorithmic Fairness Initiative, which we covered in a recent Explainer article by Julian Lutz, one of our graduate fellows on our teams. One group of workers that seems particularly vulnerable to AI, and a group that we're especially focused on here at New America, are workers with disabilities. Could you give us a sense, Commissioner Sonderling, of what your agency is doing to protect workers in light of AI, and especially for disabled workers out there?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for hosting this and having me, and to my fellow panelists. I've just really been enjoying listening to your unique perspectives on these issues. And I just want to take a step back, because I'm coming from a little different lane than everything you've just heard. So the EEOC, we are the civil rights agency enforcing workplace laws that prevent discrimination and promote equal employment opportunity in the workplace. So, originally when we started looking at AI in the workplace, is very similar to the conversations you just heard, where it wasn't really about the job displacement yet. That was really pushed later down the road with generative AI, and everything you heard from Lisa really brought that to global attention. When we first started looking about this, it was how HR departments were using artificial intelligence to make decisions that were normally made by humans. And when diving into it, we found that there's for each step of the employee life cycle, from the very beginning to draft a job description, where to advertise, who to recruit, what resumes to look at, how to look and rank the resumes, who to select for an interview, actually conducting the interview, making job offers, determining compensation. And then, as you heard, when you get to work, your entire employment relationship in some industries can be completely managed by an algorithm. And your performance is going to be based what an algorithm sets on you. And if you don't hit those goals, there's even algorithms out there that will tell you you're fired. So diving into this from my perspective, really as the regulator of human resources, we found from A to Z of the employment relationship, there's AI software out there that is promising employers not only to make these decisions that HR departments have been making for decades more efficiently, more effectively, more economically, but to remove human bias from that employment decision making, which obviously has plagued employment decision making since the beginning of time. It's the reason my agency exists. So, really diving into that front end when so much of the software in my space is about not necessarily displacing workers, which we'll get to as the generative AI conversation came into play and what role my agency plays there, but actually using AI to make employment decisions. And this really goes into more of the tech equation and the employer equation, that the technology needs to be both, properly designed, which is largely on the vendors, and then carefully used by the companies who are buying the software, which are two separate and distinct issues that we've had to tackle, both on the design side, and how's the algorithm going to do what it's saying it's supposed to do by getting you the most, either diverse candidates, the most qualified candidates, taking the skills-based approach to hiring, which you hear so much with algorithms claim they can do, because they remove the ability to discriminate, because algorithms don't know if it's what the person looks like, what the person sounds like, and that is largely on the vendor. And then on the use side, internally within the organizations using this, you can have the most perfectly designed algorithms that masks whether the applicant is a male or female, that doesn't let you know if that applicant is pregnant or disabled or religiously observant. And then with the amount of data available that these tools have, the issue there, if used improperly, by these organizations, it could scale discrimination to the likes we've never seen before. Really quick, there's a stat in talent acquisition that a talent acquisition professional, 6.5 seconds is all your whole life. That's the amount of time they look at a resume before when it's PDF. So if that person has bias, it takes time to discriminate. Where some of these algorithmic tools, if not properly designed, not carefully used, with a few clicks, you can scale discrimination to the likes we've never seen before. So that's a little different than the equations we've been talking about displacing workers. If algorithms are not properly designed and carefully used, it can really eliminate workers' ability to even participate in the workforce based upon those protected characteristics. On the flip side, if it is properly designed and carefully used, it can actually really help us get past a lot of the barriers where, as you said, disabled workers or workers in certain protected characteristics have historically not been able to get past the first part of interviews or have their applications read because of those protected characteristics being in there, which obviously employers are not allowed to use. So diving into this, when we launched our AI initiative at the EEOC, what is the most critical issue for us to dive in first? And that was around disabled workers. And if you look at what our statistics are at the EEOC, because we see almost every case of employment discrimination nationally, whether you work for the federal government, state or local government, private sector, union, staffing agency, we see all the charge of discrimination. Outside of retaliation, which is the number one charge of discrimination every single year, disability discrimination is the actual number one underlying cause of discrimination, with almost 36% of all of our cases. So we decided to tackle that area first because, as you know, disabled workers using these tools, number one, they need to have the same accommodations that they would have if they were going to an interview in person, or if they're asked to be taking an employment assessment test, whether they need more time, whether they need adaptive devices. Those same principles apply to interviews being done by artificial intelligence. Number two, we found that these tools, largely having an interview or your workforce done by an algorithm, can't screen out workers with disabilities. And it has the potential to do that if those accommodations were there. And also, the amount of data that these algorithms can collect, they also cannot collect any medical information that an employer wouldn't be able to collect otherwise, that would impact their ability to do the job, not relevant to the job. So those were the three main things we wanted to get out first and foremost. Secondly, a big part of our initiative, being in the executive branch, is going back to basics and saying, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which just celebrated its 60th birthday last month, is one of the most historic civil rights laws of all time. And as an agency, whether you're using humans to make employment decisions, or now you're injecting algorithms to make the employment decision, to assist with the employment decision, at the end of the day, there's going to be an employment decision. And there's longstanding civil rights laws that protect workers for each of those employment decisions. So we're going to always continue to look at the results, whether it's an algorithm or whether it's a human, to make sure that there's no bias in there, that disability didn't come into play, that age, religion, national origin, race, all the protected characteristics, it still applies the same to the results of that employment decision, whether or not it's a human or it's a robot. And I think a lot of people are losing sight of that, especially with the advances of technology and how do we regulate the technology. We don't understand the algorithm because we're not technologists. We've had to slow that conversation down, break through the noise and saying, look, we've been dealing with the black box of the human brain to see if there's discrimination as long as the agency exists. And now, with this technology, we can't be intimidated by not knowing, how the actual algorithm works. We're always going to look at the results. And that's really what our initiative has been based on. I say our laws are old, but they're not outdated. And they're going to apply to every decision employers make with technology or not. And we can't lose sight of that.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Sonderling. It is really insightful just to get a sense of what the federal government is doing around this AI and employment intersection. We have time for maybe one question from the audience, so I'm going to get right to it and dive in. There's a question in the audience with respect to state policy making, and this is an open question. Anyone can take it. Are there any draft policy recommendations for states looking to test AI policy that is more supportive of workers while the federal policy is being developed and sorted out? Open floor. Andrea, I know you referenced state, and Amanda, please.
I mean, I'll start by saying that there's a lot of really good progressive pro-worker legislation that is emerging in the states. And I would say that it's happening on a parallel track as the federal government. Two things. The federal government, most of what we've seen is regulatory, and there's been some very good regulatory work done. And I think states are also embracing that. In terms of state policy, I think what we'll see at the federal level is probably more industrial policy that is supporting the infrastructure to build and deploy AI at scale, competition policy, things like that. At the state level, I think we're going to see a lot of efforts to build in guardrails around privacy and surveillance. I would point to California and New York particularly, but many states are starting to develop and adopt different types of policies. And this is on sort of AI specifically. I think there's been interesting work done on gig work for a long time at the state level, data-driven gig work and tech-driven gig work. And then I'll also say that as we in the labor movement are preparing really for the next legislative session to put a lot of worker guardrails in at the state level, industry has also been gearing up at the state level for many years. And so you're starting to see copycat bills that are really bad for workers emerging around AI and tech regulation. And so I would say really the state legislative sessions next year will be very, very interesting to watch.
And in our space, what you're seeing, whether New York City's local law 144 or some of the proposals out of California, or what originally we saw in Illinois with the Facial Recognition Video Act, basically barring it in that state, what you're seeing is states taking a certain interest on certain areas So like in New York, right? If you're using AI to make an employment decision in New York City, then you'd have to do pre-deployment testing, really bias audit testing. But if you look at the testing, it's only for promotion, hiring and promotions, and only for race, sex, and ethnicity, where, it could cause confusion for, employers in New York City thinking that, they're compliant with the law if they're only testing for hiring and promotions, race, sex, and ethnicity. Well, federal law still applies in all these places. And if you're going to, the EEOC is going to require you to make sure that's being lawfully used more than just hiring and promotion, the entire employment relationship, more than just race and ethnicity, all protected categories. So you could see where it could be a misdirection for some employers thinking they're compliant with these certain areas and potentially not auditing or dealing with those other areas that are still protected in federal law. So that's another difficulty in the challenges when state and local governments are regulating outside federal legislation.
Yeah, I want to jump in. I mean, I think there's a really good example, the algorithmic management regulation or law in California that was passed, that was really, led by people working in Amazon warehouses to limit the ways that algorithms can be deployed and quotas measured. And, there's a federal bill that was introduced a few weeks ago around this, I think is a really good model of the kind of proactive policies that we can be advancing. But I really want to emphasize what Amanda just said, because I think it is so important that right now at the state level, there is a need to develop and socialize a proactive set of policies that are being advanced. I think next year is absolutely critical, like what Amanda just said, that we have to get ready for and have a proactive state agenda that is advancing in the next legislative cycle. And I think it's essential that we build some real bridges and an ecosystem that brings labor together, economic justice folks, and then people working on racial justice and civil rights orientation around these issues to be on the same page. I think right now our engagement around AI and tech tends to be very siloed, that there are different communities working on different aspects of the issues, but the tech industry is coming at it with an aggressive integrated agenda, and we are fighting on each front on our own, and we need to, I think, coalesce and bring our power together. And there is, right now, there has been just a massive onslaught of bills that are being designed by the tech industry and moved. And what we see and what I hear at the state level is that legislators are going to the tech sector and seeing them as experts to help them decide what the frameworks are. And that, there's been, we call them the Workday bills, that, that Workday, this company, has been advancing in a set of states a comprehensive policy that they package as being pro-worker, pro-civil rights, but that is actually, a set of policies that is enshrining and institutionalizing a framework for regulating AI that is going to set workers and communities back so far. And the legislators are not always, but often, even Democrats, like reflectively going to the tech sector to make meaning and to give an orientation on what's happening. And the amount of money that they are pouring into lobbying is astronomical. And the only way that we can counteract that influence is by having a clear agenda of what we're against, what we're for, and bringing workers and being aligned with other allies to advance and defend against the bad things that are happening, and then start to advance a proactive agenda. But we need to, I think there's often a tendency that we think we are not experts on these issues, but we are. We know more about this and how this is impacting workers. Workers know, and if we get them mobilized and organized and engaging at the state level, we have a chance to rebalance the power dynamic that is currently playing out.
So I was part of a roundtable at the White House between unions and developers. And the talk was meant to support the President Biden's I think it was an 8-point executive order about AI and the workforce. So just to point out there are federal initiatives, of course, as well as state. And for me, these conversations I think are tremendously important. And I was, very glad that the unions were included in this conversation with developers, but it was also frustrating because, to Andrea's point, developers insist they don't need regulation, right? That's their big push. And part of what they were really flaunting was, we have ethics boards. We all have ethics boards, and we're talking to the community, we're talking to users, and we're going to do this right, so you don't need to regulate us, right? And one of them, in fact, argued that we were conflating developers and deployers, right? So basically, they just make the software, they can't control how it's used. And so I got to the point of frustration where I said, okay, but that's like a gun manufacturer saying, we just make them, we don't know how people use them, right? So I think that on the state, well, certainly state going forward, if things go a certain way in November, but on the federal level too, we on the union side, on the labor side, have to insist on some sort of regulation.
Very insightful. I think we have time for one last question with maybe brief responses. I wish we could go just on and on because this is extraordinarily insightful. We have a question about the international view. So we went from federal, we went to state, and now thinking globally too. And the question is, acknowledging the great points made about international perspectives here, do you see difficulties or opportunities in developing an international set of guardrails for responsible use of AI in employment?
Well, I'll start on that one because if you look at the EU's AI Act, where they've designated the use of AI, in a lot of cases, is high risk. Well, what does that mean? What do developers and deployers have to do? And a big part of that, whether it's going in some what you see some states are mimicking about worker consent, being able to know that they're being subject to these algorithms, which there's no law requiring that now in the U.S. I want to go back to the requirement of bias auditing and bias audit testing, which we've seen in New York, we're seeing in Colorado, we're seeing in California, seeing it in the EU. Well, how do you conduct if the EU is requiring, if you're going to use AI in employment, to do a pre-deployment audit, to do yearly audits like New York City and others? Well, how do you do that? That goes back to what I was saying before, where you have to look at the longstanding principles on how to test for employment discrimination. And whether you're going to be in the EU or New York City, but really the global standard on how to test for disparate impact through these AI tests is the EEOC's 1978 guidelines on uniform employment selection procedures. So, as there's new advances, as there's now requirements, employers being forced to do certain things, which they could be voluntarily doing now, and they could have been voluntarily doing since the 1960s, it's going to go back to that framework that has been available for the EEOC, from the EEOC, that we're now bringing to light again as you're starting to see a lot of these requirements. So as you see more pushing and forcing, it's still, I believe, coming back to a lot of long-standing employment principles, because at the end of the day, there's only a finite amount of employment decisions: hiring, firing, wages, trainings, promotions, benefits. And that's what we regulate. And that's what we have a lot of guidance on now.
I'll also say, I think given the foreign policy focus of our innovation policy in the United States, and the disparate impacts around the globe, not only of the sort of socio-technical impacts of AI, like how these technologies actually impact human beings, but also the human value chain of labor that goes into building these technologies. Workers only win when we build global solidarity around these types of technologies. And in fact, that is what corporations are doing. They're sort of venue shopping to find places to do testing of new technologies. A lot of that happens in developing economies where workers don't have as many protections. And that has a very powerful impact on how these technologies develop and then how they show up in the United States. So really thinking globally, both about the opportunities in the big shifts that are happening right now in global global economy and supply chains, but also U.S. foreign policy. There are a lot of opportunities in there for workers if we are collaborating, but also the opportunity to really get regulation right, get market concentration rules right. If we do that in big, powerful markets, it impacts the entire industry. So yes, we need to be collaborating, and we need to be very smart at collaborating at multiple levels of how the sort of infrastructure of AI is being developed.
Yeah, and I just want to add that I think we need to be paying a lot of attention to digital trade, because this is an arena where the technology sector is actively engaging to shape global rules that favor them. And that is a place that, we have been successful in other industries in terms of really looking at the labor supply chain and the impact globally. And so I think we've got to look at digital trade. And I think we have to really think about global supply chain agreements as they're applied to technology and how it's playing out, and really see, there's a tremendous amount of power that we have on a regulatory and policy making level to shape not just the actions and impacts of the technologies in the US, but globally. And how do we really look at that? And I do think that, the Brussels effect, the idea that you can, in the EU pass regulation and policy that impacts the behavior globally of companies. I think we need to really think about how do we have that orientation in the US in terms of how we think about policy making and situate what we're asking for and what we're fighting for in the context of the globe.
Very, very insightful. Again, I wish we could go on and on, but we are at time. So with that, Keith, Amanda, Lisa, Andrea, thank you so much for your time and your expertise for this discussion. To all of our audience, thank you for tuning in. This is the start of more conversations around this issue set for the Future of Work and Innovation Economy program here. We are very interested, especially Amanda, around this intersection between industrial policy, labor policy, and science policy. Just nodding to our event we had for the NSF last month, and certainly, there's lots of opportunity to connect that to the international conversation and foreign discussion as well. So I think it's a great note to end on, as it alludes and sets us up for our next discussion. Thanks again very much for tuning in, and thanks for your interest in this work.
Thanks so much. Take care.